started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Cafe Oleh. My name is Jay. I'm a volunteer with Nefesh B'Nefesh. I myself made Aliyah with them over 15 years ago. And here at Cafe Oleh, we go over the everyday Hebrew you need here in Israel to succeed, from paying your bills to going grocery shopping to striking up a conversation, going on a date, keeping up with the news, everything that you would talk about and use in your everyday life in your respective countries of origin, but here in Israel and here in Hebrew. As always, we want to hear from you what topics you'd like us to cover. You can write to us either in the chat window here if you're joining us live on Zoom, or email Nefesh B'Nefesh directly. All of our lessons go up on YouTube within a few days of the lesson. I'm actually going to take you through it today because we're going to talk about a topic we've discussed a little bit before, go slightly in more depth today. And let's actually get started. One more piece of housekeeping before we get on, as well as announcement about next week. If you have any questions about what we're talking about in this specific lesson, please write it only in the Q&A window here on Zoom. If you have questions, concerns, comments, ideas for future lessons, please write that in the chat room only. I will only be looking at the Q&A window during this class. All right, let's get started. So in just under a week, actually about 5 days from now, begins the holiday of Shavuot. Shavuot is an interesting holiday in that even though it is celebrated by Jews around the world, in Israel, it has there's often a different way of celebrating, or a unique way to celebrate. I often equate it with, we talked about this a few weeks ago, with Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaAtzmaut being two holidays that are uniquely Israeli, and sometimes it's hard to connect with them if you're coming from abroad. I would say outside of religiously observant communities, Shavuot is very much the same way here in Israel, because it's very much not only connected with the land of Israel, but it's also connected with important part of Israeli history, a little bit we're going to go into today to further explain the holiday. I first want to, before we start with today's lesson, I want to show you how to access previous lessons. And this is important because one of the many traditions, both here in Israel and around the world, that Jews have for Shavuot is to eat dairy foods. I'm not going to go through dairy foods in length because we've actually done that in the last few weeks. And I'm going to show you exactly where we did it. So if I pull up my screen, just one second, make sure that I can see it. Aha. There we go. Okay, so as always, like I said, if you go to youtube.com, that's youtube.com, if any of you didn't know that, and you simply look for Cafe Oleh, you'll see the very first thing is a playlist of all of our previous lessons, okay? This is the tutorial for all of you who've asked how to find it. Here it is. If I click on View Full Playlist, you will see a list of all of them, and you will see, if you scroll down just a little, only several weeks ago is food, dairy products, and Hebrew foodstuffs. If you click on that, you will get a full detailed lesson of a lot of the dairy products that are often different in Israel versus other countries, which is why we're not going to go through them today. But this is a great place for you to review, not just ahead of Shavuot, but of all of our previous lessons. If you didn't know how to access it before, don't say you didn't know. So with that, let me open up today's vocab, because that is a previous lesson, as I just showed you. Aha. Share screen. Okay. So like I said, we're talking today about Shavuot. It's the next big holiday that comes up. It starts Saturday night. In Israel, it's one day. In the rest of the world among observant Jews, it's 2 days. And it's important to understand, like I said, some of the differences in how it's celebrated here in Israel, whether you're religious, non-religious, just have the day off. So first off, the name, Shavuot. We've talked about this before. This is in no way trying to lessen someone's connection to their diaspora community and where they come from and where their several generations have been. However, in modern Hebrew, the name is Shavuot. That is the name of the holiday. It is not pronounced like Sfaradim and Sfaradim and Mizrahim pronounced it differently up until the advent of modern Hebrew, just as Ashkenazim pronounce it differently. It's Shavuot. If you say it by any other name and any other accent, chances are people in Israel are not going to understand you. Okay, so for example, if you are Sephardi or Mizrahi and you say Shavuot, Shavuot or Shavuoth, very few people are going to understand you, and the same goes for Shavuos. Unless you are in communities, the majority of which understand what you're speaking, if you just go to a random supermarket or a random makolet or anything like that, in Israel, chances are people aren't going to understand you, except they are going to understand Shavuot. Just another note out there, because we teach cultural context here as much as actual words and phrases. Another name for this holiday is Chag Matan Torah. Remember, Shavuot, like many of our holidays, in particular the Shalosh Regalim, the three pilgrimage festivals, are connected to both a historical, religio-historical moment, as well as an agricultural moment in Israel. And the two are usually held in parallel. Shavuot, as you hear from the name, Chag Matan Torah, right? It's the commemoration of Moses getting the Torah on Har Sinai, Mount Sinai. It's called Shavuot because it's the end of the weeks, right? Shavuot means weeks, W-E-E-K-S. 1 week is Shavua, excuse me. It's the weeks between Pesach, the last big holiday we celebrated, and the upcoming one. And in those weeks, we count what we call the Omer. Okay, the Omer is as much about getting ourselves to Har Sinai to get the Torah, as it is the Omer. The Omer was the young green barley that was given as an offering to the temple in its stages of growth, in its stages of maturity to get to Shavuot. And we're going to talk about why that's so important, the agricultural aspect, in just a second. One of the other names you may not be familiar with, but you will come across here in Israel, is Chag HaMayim, the Festival of Water. It's a tradition among some North African Jewish communities to spend the holiday with water, that it's the beginning of the hot season, hot weather, and one of the traditions is to splash each other friendly with water. So for those of you who are water averse, or you're deciding to go out on Chag and wear silk, I advise you to avoid public parks, because this is a tradition. It's not necessarily a widespread one, but if you're really concerned about being splashed by water by innocent kids, try to avoid public parks for your picnic or whatever have you on the day. Another really important, the next two names are really important, and they go back to what I was saying, the agricultural aspect, and that's what really defines it as unique here in Israel, because it has to do with the land of Israel. One of the names is Chag HaKatzir, and one of the names is Chag HaBikurim, right? This one holiday has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different names. Let's start with the first one, Chag HaKatzir. Katzir, we're going to go through in a little bit. We usually translate as the festival of the harvest or the reaping. I talked about the Omer, that green young barley. Well, after those 50 days that we counted from Shavuot, from Pesach, it's now ripe for harvest. And that's where this name comes, the festival of the harvest or the reaping. And one of the traditional offerings given at the temple was the Omer, was the sheaf of wheat, or in this case, barley. Okay, we're going to get to that in a second, why that's so important. The other one that's very much related is Chag HaBikurim. This often gets translated as Festival of the First Fruits. Shavuot went under a massive reconfiguration in Israeli society in the last 150 years, very much thanks to the second and third Aliyah. The second Aliyah and the third Aliyah, that's usually slated between the early 1900s through the 1930s. This is when the kibbutz movement started. Even though the kibbutz movement was always small, even though the amount of kibbutzim that are still operating as kibbutzim is still small, even though I'm sure many people on this call will not necessarily adhere to the values and ethics that guided the kibbutz movement to this day, it's still fundamental to understanding Israeli culture and society to this day. It has a outsized influence on what we do, who our leaders are. Everyday things that we have here in Israel can be traced to the kibbutz movement. It's so important. I'm actually watching a great documentary called HaKibbutz. Its co-director and its moderator, is a television personality who sadly passed away actually today. His name was Modi Bar-On. You can find it on YouTube. It's with Hebrew subtitles, obviously in Hebrew. It's a great history of the kibbutz movement. But they talk a lot about this, and it's understanding the traditions that they created in trying to create a new Jew that connected to the land of Israel affects us to this day, and why Shavuot here in Israel, even if you are not religiously observant, is important, and it's connected to food and the land and harvest. So with that, and talking about importance of harvest, if you remember last week, right, we talked about different verbs that have to do with very specific items of clothing, right? You don't just wear footwear. You use a very specific verb, lin'ol, when it comes to footwear. Or if it's eyewear, it's la'alkiv, right? We don't use the verb lilbosh for very specific items. Hebrew is very specific when it comes to certain agricultural things as well. First off, the word katzil. Chag katzil. Katzil comes from lekatzer, to cut. Katzar is short. Katzil has to do with harvesting grain. We only use this term to refer to grain. And that again goes back to the omel, right? The barley offering that was given at the temple. That's why the other name for this is Chag HaKatzil. This is when the grains that are grown in Israel are ripe to harvest. Okay, so Chag HaKatzil comes from this word katzil, and it's the harvest for grain, which is about to start. Another word that we have for harvest, but for a very specific crop, is batzir or batzir. Batzir is grapes, right? This is the grape harvest, both for eating and for making wine. This goes through spring and into late summer here in Israel. These words are really important. You're going to hear these words, whether you are a wine connoisseur or not, whether you eat grains here or not. The point, though, is Israel and the land of Israel and Hebrew are so intermeshed and intertwined. These words take on meaning, and you're going to hear these words actually pretty often, especially as Israel's become a foodie destination. You're going to hear these words more and more in Hebrew. So we had katzil, which is for grain, batzil, which is the harvest for grapes. The next one is masik. Masik is the very specific word we use for harvesting olives. This usually happens in the winter. And again, you're only going to use this word masik for olives. Another one you've probably heard before is katif. Katif deals with fruit on trees. So citrus fruit, apples, pomegranates, anything like that that grows on a tree is katif. And finally, we have asif. Asif is the harvest of vegetables and pretty much everything. If you needed a general word, it's asif. Asif is actually the name of the new the Culinary Institute of Israel, which is just down the street from me here in Tel Aviv. It's a beautiful place, and it's very much an homage to Israeli cuisine and Israeli food ingredients and stuff. So it's appropriately called asif, the harvest of everything, right? So these 5 words are important to understand Shavuot's connection to the land and how ingrained it is here in Israel, because we will use these words, right? If you're going to buy specialty olive oil, for example, it's going to tell you not only the type of the olive oil, it's going to tell you when the masik was, when the harvest took place. If you are into wine, the harvest is quite important. When were the grapes picked? And then turned into the process starting into wine. So the batzil is very important. Actually, vineyards will open themselves up to the public sometimes to help with the batzil, to help with the grape harvest so that they can harvest quickly enough to start producing wine. Okay, so those are all the terms that come with Chag HaKatzil, why this holiday is so important with regards to agriculture, the kibbutz movement, and everything else. And the other name, like I said, is Chag HaBikurim. Chag HaBikurim, we usually translate as Festival of the First Fruits. Where does this term come from? We have this term Bikurim, right? Here in row 6 and row 12. Bikurim with that root of Bet Kaf Resh, right? That shoresh of 3 letters. Bikurim really refers to first fruits, right? This is the holiday again. You bring the first fruits of the season to the temple as an offering. The same root gets us the word bechor or bechor, which is the firstborn, a firstborn son in this case. That has obviously a lot of importance in Jewish tradition, in the Tanakh, in the Bible, in terms of inheritance. That's an important term. The death of the firstborn, the 10th plague of the in Pesach was Makata Bechorot. That's how you say it in Hebrew, the plague of the firstborn. Okay, or befalling the firstborn would be more appropriate. And Bechorah. Bechorah is actually a really important word. It means premiere in modern Hebrew. So if you were going to a Hakranat Bechorah, you would be going to a premiere screening of a film. L'hakrin is to screen a film. Hakrana is a screening. So Hakranat Bechorah is a premiere screening of a film. Hatzagat Bechorah is a premiere performance on stage, right? This is a word you're going to hear a lot, Bechorah, premiere. Okay. So I want to go back to that agricultural bit because it's important how Israelis celebrate. What you're going to see in the street in Israel, we'll get to the food in a little bit, but in terms of decorations, Shavuot is known for a lot of different traditions of decorating with green plants, with flowers, but one of them is with shibolet. Shibolet goes back to that term katzil we just said. Shibolet is an ear of grain. It can refer to an ear of corn. It can refer to the top of wheat or barley or any grain. All of those seeds that are shaped, you know, the classic wheat top of wheat chaff, that is shibolet. And the plural is shibolim. From this, we get the term shibolet shu'al, which is how we say oats in Hebrew. The point, though, is shibolet is a very classic way to decorate for Shavuot. So you will see lots of shibolim, ears of grain, being festooned everywhere or being sold as bouquets. You'll see them in all sorts of different aspects, certainly in illustrations, advertising discounts for Shavuot and things like that. Another thing you'll typically find, and this is very much about not just the offerings given at the temple, but also the kibbutz movement, is a teneh. Teneh is this fancy word you only hear during Shavuot. It's the same in Hebrew as sal. Sal is a basket. Teneh is also a basket. It's meant to be a woven basket. And typically, you fill in it with fruits and other things to give either to each other or you bring to school. I remember hearing this from a fellow Anglo of their daughter coming to them one Shavuot, and you know, American Anglo, and her daughter, fully Israeli, comes to her and asks her to buy her a teneh for school, a public secular school. She had no idea what it was because that's not a word we normally use, right? She finally found a teneh. It's just a woven basket. You'll actually see in the supermarkets, they will sell both empty baskets, but also ones filled with gifts that you can bring to a meal or give to each other. It's a really nice custom that you see. And the other part that you'll also see both randomly on the street, but also especially when it comes to the kibbutzim, are zer la roche. Zer la roche. Zer is both a bouquet of flowers. It's also a wreath or a garland. And this is meant to be worn la roche, on the head. It's a very common Israeli tradition on birthdays for women, but also men do this, to wear a zer la roche if they're having a party, or even you'll be out at a restaurant and you'll see the person celebrating their birthday wearing a zer la roche, a head garland, usually made out of flowers. On Shavuot, you also see this made out of shibolim. You'll see it woven or braided with whatever you call these, sheaves of wheat. That's one of the words for it, right? And that's very traditional. You can think of like stereotypical kibbutz celebrations for Shavuot. Again, kibbutzim were traditionally non-religious or anti-religious even. There are religious kibbutzim, but they created their own rituals. So one of them for Shavuot was for the girls and boys to wear all white. They would perform rikudei am, folk dancing, carrying these teneh these woven baskets with fruit and wearing a zer larosh on their heads, on different wreaths and garlands on their head. You'll see all these things manifested in how everyday Israelis celebrate, even if you're not on a kibbutz. You'll see a lot of people go to a kibbutz or somewhere agricultural on Shavuot, or out, certainly to have a picnic outside, because it's meant to be connected with the land and the harvest and everything becoming ripe, the first fruits becoming ripe. So again, that's all the traditions that you find here in Israel. You may not have heard of before, you may not have experienced before since coming to Israel, but no less important and certainly no less welcoming to you here now as Olim, or soon to be Olim. Okay, obviously the other part is dairy products. I don't want to go through all dairy products because we've done that in the past and I showed you that earlier. I just want to go through a couple that are important cultural differences, because again, this is not a class about me being a human dictionary for you. This is about providing you with cultural context as much as practical information. They're actually the same thing. First off, what I think is one of the more important things of Shavuot, ugat gvina. Ugat gvina is how we say cheesecake in Hebrew. It is literally cake of cheese, right? It's nothing too fancy here, but in case anyone asks, it's ugat gvina. You can buy many of these. You can buy ugot gvina, which is the plural, cheesecakes in both bakeries as well as supermarkets. Keep in mind, though, and we're going to get into this further in a second, many of the cheesecakes that are pre-made in Israel are not made American style. If you're thinking of the American style Cheesecake Factory or Sara Lee or any of those kinds that are made with American style cream cheese that are thick and rich, remember, Israel, as much as it loves American culture, is still very Eurocentric. So cheesecakes here are usually lighter, they're usually fluffier, they usually don't have that same tang flavor to it. And the ones you'll usually buy pre-made in a store or a bakery are the more European style ones. So you need to ask, and we'll get to how you ask in a second, if that's important to you. It's important to me, so therefore I hope it's important to some of you. If you're going to make it on your own, this is an important term to know, gvinat shamenet. We talk about this in the dairy terms, but it's important to go over again. Gvinat shamenet literally translates as cream cheese. Just like ugat gvina translates as cheesecake, gvinat shamenet translates as cream cheese. But just like the other one, this doesn't translate literally. Okay, so if you hear me saying cream cheese here, look that it's in quotations for a reason. Okay, it's in quotations for a reason, because when you go to the supermarket in Israel, a makolet or a super, you're going to see tons and tons and tons of dairy products that are called gvinat shamenet, or something that's called shamenet levana, white cream. And it looks like cream cheese from the label. It's spreadable, it's white, you think it's cream cheese. It is not. Okay, if you pick up any of these things and it just says gvinat shamenet, chances are it is not what you're looking for if you're trying to make an American style cheesecake or an American style bagel and lox with a smear of cream cheese. That's not this. What you are going to look for, both for cream cheese as well as if you're going to buy a pre-made cheesecake and you want an American style, you're going to ask for signon americai. Signon means style, americai, American. Okay, so if this is on the label, it is American style. So if you are looking to buy your own, to make your own cheesecake this year, excuse me, to make your own ugat gvina, and they don't have Philadelphia cream cheese, many places do, but obviously this time of year there's a run on it, you're going to look for gvinat shamenet besignon americai. Okay, cream cheese American style. That's what you're going to look for. If you don't see signon americai on the label, whether it's Israeli or imported, it's not going to be Philadelphia cream cheese. What it's going to be is a spreadable, very delicious, but not what you're looking for, cheese. Those are the things, for example, that also are known as ski or Symphonia, and they come in all different flavors as well as just plain. But Gvinat Shamenet Besignon Americai is the American style cream cheese. Anytime throughout the year. So any of you who are worried about that or about to make that mistake, hopefully I saved you from that, but it's nonetheless delicious. Another small but important cultural distinction. In Israel, blintzes are blinches. Okay, this is a bit like saying Shavuos to someone who is not Ashkenazi and is not Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox. Blintzes is going to be understood by some people, but just a slight change of the word pronunciation. Blinches will be understood by everyone. Okay, it's certainly popular. It's not as popular as other dairy products like ugat vina, but you will find blinches being sold frozen, fresh, recipes for them, all sorts of different things. Okay, but just know in Israel we call them blinches, and it's spelled like that. Interestingly enough, if you took out that apostrophe, what we call a geresh, it would be pronounced the way we say it elsewhere in the world, but it's still pronounced in Israel blinches. Okay, so blinches, ugat gvina, shamenet, gvinat shamenet besignon Amerikai, you have all been warned and given lots of instruction how to celebrate this holiday if you want to celebrate like your respective countries of origin. Plenty of other foodstuffs to be had, though, on this very delicious holiday, especially here in Israel because of its agricultural connection. It's got that foodie element. What I want to take you through at the end of this, and then I'm going to get to your questions, is a very, very classic Israeli dish. It has so many variations, but this is classic Israeli home cooking. I don't think you, even in like a worker's restaurant, would you find this, but you will find it on almost every table at least once a week, whether it's on Shabbat, because it can be served warm or at room temperature, or throughout the week, is pashtida. Pashtida is we best describe it as a crustless quiche. And it is exactly that. It is eggs and some other ingredients that you can add all sorts of different variations and flavors to. You bake it in the oven. It is very forgiving, very easy to make, a classic to have on Shavuot. Think of it like a frittata or an omelet, just a little bit easier to make. And it's served all the time. It is a classic home cooking thing, pashtida. Pashtida typically has in it, row 26, beitza, or beitzim, the plural of beitza, eggs. It also typically has either kemach lavan or kemach tofeach. Kemach is flour, kemach lavan is white flour, or kemach tofeach. Kemach tofeach is self-raising flour. This is a very popular ingredient in Israel to have. It's not that we don't use yeast, and you can certainly buy yeast, but kemach tofeach is very widely found, very widely used. It already has some of the yeast as well as baking powder and or baking soda mixed into it. So it already has self-raising agents in it, so it's easier to use. And pashtida is known to have some sort of flour base. Instead of that crust that quiche has, you add some flour to it to give it some density, but also some lift. So when it bakes in the oven, it gets a little high. Okay, these are really the basic things to it. You can add all sorts of things to it. People add cheese, people add vegetables. You can even make it a meat version. I gave you one classic ingredient here, as well as some of the verbs that we use with it. There are countless recipes online for pashtida in Hebrew and as well as in English. Whether you make it for Shavuot or not, this is a classic. If you have children and they're going to other people's homes, I'm sure they've had this before. If you don't make it already at home, it's worth finding a recipe and start making it yourself. But just go through some of the words together with it, since we're already talking about food. So one of a classic ingredient readily available in Israel in the frozen section is afunat gina. Afunat gina are garden peas or green peas, however you want to pronounce it or say it in English. You can get these pretty inexpensively, and they're frozen, flash frozen, so they're fresh in the freezer once you use them. Some people will just simply put those in with the eggs and the kemach tofeach and stick in the oven, and that's done. Some people will add other vegetables, and then they will lehakpitz the vegetables together. Lehakpitz is to saute. Lehakpitz comes from the same verb, the same root as likfotz, which is to jump, right? Lehakpitz is to cause something to jump. So think of when you're sauteing something in a pan, you are causing it to jump. You are moving it around. You're flipping the pan up. That's lehakpitz. Lehakpitz is saute. This is also the term that we use for stir frying something. We don't have quite the difference in Israel. So for example, if you go to a Pan-Asian restaurant, and oftentimes they're very Pan-Asian in Israel as opposed to one cuisine or another, you'll see a variety of mukpatzim, right? Mukpatzim is the past participle of lakpitz, and that simply means a dish that has been sauteed or stir-fried. So a mukpatzim, the list of mukpatzim dishes are simply stir-fried dishes. Simple as that. Okay, so from lakpitz, we get saute and to stir-fry. Le'arbev. Le'arbev, once you've sauteed your vegetables, you need to mix it in with the beitzim and the kemach. You need to le'arbev. Le'arbev is to mix. Okay, le'arbev is also to mix within a crowd. That's also a term. Me'ulbav and lo me'ulbav means to be part of a community or not part of a community, to mix in, to mingle within a group of people, but it also means in a cooking sense to mix. Okay, and finally, pashteda is known to be baked. It is not frittata, it is not an omelet, it is not done on the stovetop. It is typically finished in the oven. Think of like a Pyrex dish, rectangular glassware dish that it's cooked in, so that it can be cut into squares or rectangles. To bake, le'efot, whether that's ugat gvina or pashteda, le'efot is your verb for to bake. Okay, I'm going to stop here, keep it nice and brief again, because you have a whole other lesson of dairy terms to go over on your own. I want to answer some questions. I have people asking about cream cheese again. So, okay, very important. It's called gvinat shemenet in Israel, cream cheese. Okay, it's going to say gvinat shemenet b'signon Amerikai. If you're buying Philadelphia cream cheese, it comes in a Philadelphia cream cheese container, the same exact container you're used to seeing in the United States. If you can find that, great. If not, you're going to look for something that's either imported or Israeli, and it says Besignon Amerikai. It's not necessarily going to say, I think it's Philip here who's asking, isn't it called Gvinat Philadelphia? It is not, especially because Philadelphia is a trademark name. So even Israelis don't want to get in trouble with copyright infringement. It will be called Gvinat Shemenet Besignon Amerikai, American style cream cheese. Okay, and it is, as Lawrence points out, even though they sell it all over, it will run fast. If you haven't picked up a block or two already, chances are your makolet or super may not have any anymore. So if you need to find an alternative, like I just said, or you can make a European style cheesecake. Kathy, pashtida sounds like it's a veggie kugel. It's not. Great point, Kathy. This is an egg-based dish. It is primarily eggs with vegetables. Kugel, kigel, as it's called in Israel, kigel, is the reverse. It's primarily vegetables with some eggs added to it. Pashtida you can think of as a crustless quiche or one big omelet, if that's easier to think of, not a kigel, not a kugel. Sheila asks, can you break down the shorashim for the cooking terms such as bake and mix? Sure. So lakpitz, like I said, is kuf pe tzadi, like likfotz, to jump. Le'arbev is just like you see it. It's ayin resh bet bet. This is actually a 4-letter shoresh, a rare one. It comes from the same root as, by the way, me'urav, al, which is just ayin resh bet, which means to be something that's mixed. Lehitarev, to get mixed into something, to get involved in something. It's related to this verb. This verb, le'arbev, was created. We have a couple of these examples in Hebrew, modern Hebrew, where we simply duplicate the last letter to create a, how shall we say, adjacent definition, right? If ayin resh vet, bet means something to be mixed or involved or interacted with, ilbuv has to do with mixing in a very specific way. Okay, so we have a few examples of these, not many, but that is the root of it. And le'efot is aleph, pe, hey. You can simply take any of these verbs, Shira and everyone else, into that website I keep sharing, pe'alim.com, Pealim.com. Type in the infinitive, and it will not only give you the verb, it will give you the verb, it'll give you the shoresh, the root, and it'll give you all of the conjugations of it. Okay, so when in doubt, you can always look up the shoresh on your own. Elisheva, how do you say female firstborn? Great question. You would say bechorah, but bechor is a specifically Jewish law word that we use here because firstborn males have certain religious obligations, like the fast of the firstborn before Pesach, or Pidyon Haben, the redemption of the firstborn that's done. So Bechor is traditionally used for firstborn males. If you wanted to say a woman, you could say Bechorah or Bechorit. Okay, but the default is Bechor, but great question. Anonymous, does Kemach Tofeach always contain yeast? Does self-raising flour always contain yeast? You would need to check the label. Some do, some don't, but some of them will have a small amount in it, causing that self-raising, that raising action to take place. Good. And as Donna points out, rightly so, sauté means to jump in French. So just like it's sauté in French, it's lakpitz in Hebrew, understanding we're causing the ingredients to jump in the pan. Great question. Okay. Any last questions? Before I have some important announcement for next week. Great. So I'm going to keep talking, just keep you informed. So first off, if you want to look over dairy terms, again, you saw it on youtube.com. You can see our previous lesson on it. This one will go up in the next day or two. Next week is, we talked the other week about international terms and international relations, and I introduced you to the word chul, right? Chul means outside of Israel, chutz la'aretz, outside of Israel. And even though Sunday is Shavuot here in Israel and around the world, Monday is the second day of Shavuot for those in Chul, those outside of the land of Israel. In Israel, we only celebrate one day of Shavuot. And as such, even though we're Nefesh B'Nefesh, this is about Aliyah and Hebrew and Israel, we are very much aware that many of you are outside of Israel, hoping to come very soon here. So whether you are observant or not, we're not going to be teaching next week. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time. In the meantime, you can review all of our dairy lessons. You can review any other lessons you would like. We'll be back in 2 weeks from today. And we'll be going over one of my favorite lessons and one of yours, which is media literacy, how to read the newspaper in Hebrew when you are at a very beginner's level. Okay, so without any other questions, I'm going to leave it here for today. I hope this was helpful. Again, the other dairy terms will make it an even more complete holiday for you. And again, this is one of those holidays where you can simply just say, even though I just gave you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different ways to say the holiday that's coming up, you can also simply just wish each other a Chag Sameach. You could say Chag Shavuot Sameach, Chag Matan Torah Sameach, Chag HaKatzir Sameach, whatever you would like, but you can also simply say Chag Sameach for this holiday. So with that, I'm going to end it here. Chag Sameach. Hope you all have a great week ahead. We'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Take care. Lihitraot.